guess we'll get started. I can tell you the hardest thing I'm going to do all day today is keep that spaghetti off my shirt. Anyway, thank you for coming. My name is Mark Webster. I'm the president of the Friends of the Jefferson County Law Library. And before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to tell you about our next event. We're not going to have a speaker or an author in September, but instead we're having a fundraising event, a carnival. In a way, you are the authors because you're going to write our future. We hope that you'll come and enjoy the carnival and donate something to the Jefferson County Law Library. I look forward to seeing you there. We also will have other speakers on various books for the rest of the year.
Yes.
And you've got a schedule, I think, somewhere there around you. But right now I want to introduce our speaker here, Jayne Waldrop, who will be speaking about this book here around town. She is I guess a native of Paducah, although your family lived in eastern Kentucky, then moved to western Kentucky, so you've done the whole gamut. She has got an undergraduate degree from UK, a law degree from UK, a master's in fine arts in creative writing from Murray. She's practiced law here in town with sites in Harpston, so some of you may have had cases with her or may know her, so forth. She also worked at U of L and then in Frankfurt and so forth. I recognize her more as an author of poetry. She's written 2 books of poems and so forth, and that I was vaguely aware of. She's got a children's book, I guess is that correct, on an artist in Mayfield, Kentucky. So you must have some sort of Grave County connection, I guess.
A married one.
Married one. It's called A Journey in Color, The Art of Ellis Wilson, and that came out in December, I think, right? Mm-hmm. So the book is available. Just a few words about the book, Drowned Town here. It seems to have the word home on every page. It starts out with a quote from Edward Abbey. I don't know if you know him, the environmental writer that talks about home. And it ends, the last page, I think, has the word home mentioned 2 or 3 times. Rose, the mother of Cam, one of the characters in the book, says, a place needs water to feel like home. I mean, Louisville, look, we've got the river, and this ought to feel like home. But even quotes from an old religious song. They tell me of an uncloudy day. You know, there's a home beyond the skies and so forth. I don't know if you know that song. And there's a phrase right on the last page called the thin place that connects the earth to heaven, water to land, and the past to the present. So I think that's what this book is about, is that thin place that you try to get back to home. You know, there's no place like home. Somebody said that, didn't they? Right. So I'll shut up and let you talk.
I am so happy to be here with you today and to be in Louisville. We lived here for 22 years before we moved to Lexington. So it's always great to be back here. I'm going to start with a short reading. It's a section of the book that I don't often read when I do presentations, but this seems appropriate since many of you are attorneys or connected to the legal community here. And one of the characters in the book is Margaret, who practices law here in Louisville. I tried to write it I tried to recall my years as a young associate and sort of the vibe that some more senior partners provide in an office setting in a legal practice. Weekend visitor. Margaret Stark sat at her lacquered desk, surrounded by 2 younger lawyers, a paralegal, and a personal assistant who stood in silence and awaited her final approval of a brief that had wearied them all. The filing deadline was in 4 hours, the work on behalf of Sunderman, Inc., a valued client that kept the Louisville law firm of Marshall and Dodson busy. The hovering at the edge of the desk didn't distract Margaret as she analyzed the brief, line by line, word by word. She demanded that her staff remain on standby, ready to receive her next order, just as she had expected the associates to pull the all-nighter to finish the rewrite after yesterday's loud pronouncement that the previous draft was shit. When she arrived at her spacious corner office overlooking the Ohio River at 7 a.m. sharp, she had warned them. It had better be right. As morning became afternoon and the deadline approached, Margaret lived up to her in-house reputation for rants that bordered on emotional abuse of staff. When we finish here, I have hours of driving to get to a wedding rehearsal, but I'm not leaving until this brief is perfect. Better hope your collective missteps don't make me late, Margaret said as she gestured toward a stack of discarded drafts. She returned her attention to the document, then looked up and glared at one of the lawyers, a tall blonde with a depleted expression who shuffled from one navy blue pump to another. The shuffling stopped. Margaret didn't care if her style of legal practice exhausted the people around her. She had a history of dumping team members whose work product didn't measure up to the standard of care she reserved for her clients. She had no patience for the thin-skinned who couldn't take correction of their grammatical or stylistic weaknesses. Her undisputed status as the hardest working partner in the firm gave Margaret some measure of satisfaction. She handed the document to the tired blonde. "Text me when it's filed. I've got to get on the road," she said. The only indication that the brief met her expectations. So that's an introduction to Margaret. Margaret is from Louisville, practices law in Louisville, but is best friends with Western Kentucky, her Western Kentucky friend Cam. And Cam Weatherford is from an area in Western Kentucky that has been affected in so many ways by several major federal projects. The building of Kentucky Dam, the building of Barkley Dam, and the taking of the piece of property between the Tennessee River and the Cumberland River, formerly known as Between the Rivers, and is now a federal recreation area, a national recreation area, known as Land Between the Lakes. So, I chose Margaret to be the outsider coming in to Western Kentucky. She's very fond of the place. She doesn't know the history, or has learned the history through her friend Cam and the Weatherford family. She's an outsider, and she also represents, I think, a rural-urban divide that I think is so prevalent in our state. She and Cam represent this rural-urban divide, and I think it's kind of typical of many communities in Kentucky. You're either urban, Louisville and Lexington, Northern Kentucky, or you're rural. So I wanted to give you a little bit of the background of why I wrote the book, and also the history of Western Kentucky in the context of this book. I wanted to tell you a little bit. My husband, Alex, and I lived here for 22 years, practiced law here, had our children here, and we still have a strong connection to Louisville. In 2003, we decided we wanted to spend more time, as much time as possible, in Western Kentucky, to be closer to our aging parents and the places that we love, specifically the lakes and LBL. We saw an ad about a house that was being auctioned in Old Catawba, and it was a little ad in the Sunday Courier Journal, and it had a line drawing of the house. It's an old Victorian house in Old Catawba. The house was one of the originals in Old Catawba before the lake, when Catawba was a bustling river town on the banks of the Cumberland. So, as luck would have it, we were the lucky bidders on that house when we went to the auction. There were days when we didn't feel so lucky as we were trying to restore this house, but it was a major reason that we spent time in Catawba and that this book was inspired by the time. This was after the renovation. But I started digging into the history of Catawba, and this was our house back in around 1910. As you can see, it was a Victorian painted lady. You can see a woman sitting on the second floor window, around the window. It was a major, I guess it was an important street in Old Catawba. It now overlooks the lake. It previously had been up the hill a long way from the river, so that it was never flooded, and it also survived the construction of the dam and the rising waters of Lake Barkley. One of the first clues that we had when we looked at our deed when we bought the house was that it indicated it was on Oak Street. Well, that street is now known as Lake Barkley Drive, so that sort of intrigued me. I spent some time at Rose Hill Museum in Old Eddyville, which is not very far, it's about 10 minutes away. And I ran into this picture of the house, and it was as we were trying to decide what we wanted to do to renovate it. And as you can see, it had really extensive gardens and landscaping, and that's so unlike the way the little town looks today. Excuse me. About the same time, I was working on my MFA in creative writing at Murray State, and it seemed that every story I wrote, everything was set in Western Kentucky and set around the lakes, inspired by the lakes. So, one Christmas we were staying there at our house. We went, and that time of the year is, the water level is drawn down for winter pool. So you can see foundations all along the shoreline of houses that used to exist, of streets that used to exist, and sidewalks. So we were walking around the shoreline that day, and it made it feel as though this history was not that distant. You know, I had never lived in that part of, in these little towns that were affected by the lake. I grew up in Paducah, which was not affected. But it made the history seem very real to me. And so I kept researching, kept investigating, and was very intrigued by how the town used to look. And as you can see, Western Kentucky, this is a very long state. What I learned as I moved to Louisville and since I've lived in Lexington too, is that not a lot of people know Western Kentucky very well. A lot of Kentuckians have not been there. This area, the Jackson Purchase and the area pretty much west of Hopkinsville is known as Kentucky's Western Waterlands now. But as you can see, this little stretch that's labeled Land Between the Lakes and the two rivers is basically the setting for the book. Before the lakes, there were rivers, and they're major rivers. This 1956 map shows Kentucky Lake after it was created. It was created in the 1940s as part of the New Deal rural electrification projects. It was completed in 1945. Next came the enlargement of the Cumberland River into Lake Barkley when the dam was built. So one of the things that intrigues me is what this place looked like before and the enormous environmental and cultural changes it made when these projects were built. I wanted to talk about some of these towns. Gilbertsville was taken and destroyed in 1938. It was on the Tennessee River, and it was exactly where they wanted to build the dam that created Kentucky Lake. This is the old town of Catawba. This is in Lyon County, and it is there. It's in a bend of the river, just past Eddyville. Catawba was known for its mineral springs. It was sort of a resort town back in the day. As you can see, there's a large hotel that accommodated people who came to take the baths and to take the waters at the mineral springs. Those springs are still exist, but they're flooded much of the year. The Catawba train depot is sat right near the river, and it's one of the things that I noticed when I was walking around the shoreline on that winter day, was that you could still see railroad spikes and all sorts of old rusty tools, and this is 50 years after the lake was created. It's kind of a typical small town. Eddyville is just down the Cumberland, I guess just up the Cumberland actually. You can see how the river, this is a pre-lake aerial shot, but you can see how the river bends there, the Cumberland bends. That large structure right in the middle is the Kentucky State Penitentiary, which still exists. Sits on top of a limestone cliff. This was the old town of Eddyville. It was the county seat, so it had the courthouse and all the major county buildings in it. And currently, just a few houses exist in old Eddyville. All the downtown and commercial area, except for the prison, was torn down. Golden Pond, which I just love this picture with the hog crossing the street, crossing the road. Golden Pond is in Treat County. It's in Land Between the Lakes. It was in Land Between the Lakes, but it was a bustling community. This was a shot in '64. That must have been right before the dam was finished and the lake waters rose. Again, just another small town. Golden Pond was not the county seat, though. That's Katie's. Linton is another town that's pretty much gone. Canton also. Canton just has a couple of buildings now, an older church. It's Treat County. Fenton, also in Treat County. You can see in the background, that was Kentucky Lake after it had already been constructed. The town of Fenton was taken when, by eminent domain, the federal government purchased everything between the rivers for the LBL, for the Land Between the Lakes recreation area. And it was decided that they needed 170,000 acres to create Land Between the Lakes. So there were about 800 families, mostly farmers, some small business people, who were all moved out. One of the reasons that the dams were built is for flood prevention. Yes, rural electrification was very important, but another important public interest was in preventing floods. Western Kentucky, like Louisville, these big rivers create flooding problems if they're not controlled, and even sometimes when they are controlled. The 1937 flood, again, like in Louisville, was a major and devastating force. There's the train station. Eddyville. And again, we hear about the historic flooding of 1937, but there were significant floods, not every year, but maybe every 2 years or so, maybe not to this level. But flood control was an important reason that the dams were built. Water Street, that's sort of an interesting name. There's Canton. See, this is the flood of 1939, so there were significant floods often. You know, floods almost always happen in major floods, January, February, March. That's one of the reasons they take the water level down for winter pool, so that the water is already low when these January, February, March rains come. So this was in the early 60s. The dam was finished 1964. And once these dams were finished, and I'm focusing primarily on Barkley now, the old river towns were deconstructed. So this is Eddyville. They built new towns, and of course, if you've read the book or if you're reading the book, you know that there is one part of the book that talks about the new towns. In the book, I actually gave one of the new towns a different name of Sycamore to sort of separate it and remind people that this is fiction. My book is a work of fiction. I'm not documenting exactly what happened, but I wanted to capture more of the emotional components of loss of home and dislocation. But there were new towns, so some people chose to move their homes to these new towns. At least they were going to be on higher ground. They also built a lot of tract housing, you know, really quickly constructed and designed subdivisions in New Eddyville and New Catawba. And then in between the rivers, those communities were just truly lost there and not really rebuilt anywhere else. Those towns pretty much disappeared. One of the goals for Land Between the Lakes was to create a natural area that looked as though it were pristine woods and had never been developed. So every town had to be raised. Every home, every church, school, motel, restaurant, all of them had to be raised. And if you go to Land Between the Lakes today, you see beautiful woods, wonderful places to hike and camp, hunt during season. It's as though no one ever lived there. And Land Between the Lakes straddles 3 counties: Lyon, Lyon, Trigg, and Stewart County, Tennessee. The town of Model, Tennessee was also deconstructed. Mary Majors was an important force in Land Between the Lakes, or between the rivers. It might not be well known, but there was a significant African American community within Between the Rivers and the area now known as Land Between the Lakes. Mary Major's restaurant and an adjoining motel were both listed in the Green Book, which meant that they were considered safe places for African American travelers. Lots of different communities, Sardis community. the land acquisition office was located in Golden Pond. It was riddled with gunshots, often, as people voiced their frustration in many ways, including planned protests, as you can see. They took their case to court. They took it up to the Supreme Court, which denied that it did not hear the case. And they were fighting it on the grounds that there was not public interest to take all this property. They lost on that ground. I think John Edgerton was the lead plaintiff in that case. It went on for several years, but they did ultimately lose, and everyone was moved out.
I noticed in the one sign says TVA, go home. Was it the TVA that started this?
TVA was the management of this federal project. So they were the local face of the project and managed Land Between the Lakes for about 15 years. It was ultimately taken from TVA management and given to the U.S. Forest Service, who managed it. So TVA had been involved. TVA also manages Kentucky Dam and Kentucky Lake. So it was kind of natural for TVA to be in charge of Land Between the Lakes also. They wanted to do a lot of experimental, environmental, and education programming from Land Between the Lakes. So TVA was in charge of that, which was really out of their bailiwick of power generation, which is why the TVA was created.
Why was it the TVA versus the Corps of Engineers?
Corps of Engineers manages, now I'm not sure why it would be on Land Between the Lakes, but TVA manages Kentucky Dam and the Corps of Engineers manages Lake Barkley and Barkley Dam. So you've got both, and they're very different in their approach to. So, so there were, I think about 10,000 people moved out of Land Between the Lakes. This was after people started moving out and were moved out. This house still stands. It's one of the few buildings that for some reason was partially left intact, perhaps because it was all concrete. And today it still is around, but it has been graffitied up in such a way that it's now called Hotel California and has been since probably the mid-70s. So the homes were starting to be deconstructed. Some were moved out and taken across the rivers and put on a foundation in another town. And the restaurant that we saw earlier in the Fenton picture, this was the moving day for that restaurant. They took all the stone off, that very mid-century modern, like Bedford stone, and moved it. Golden Pond was completely taken down. And that's what it looks like today as you cross Land Between the Lakes. This is Golden Pond. That's US 6880. There are bronze markers for Eddyville and for Golden Pond. This is the area in Old Catawba where we walked and saw these places that saw foundations, and it was so evocative for me. And I took these pictures about 2 years ago, so it's all still there under the water until winter cool. This is the one structure in Land Between the Lakes that exists from the old days. St. Stephen's Church was a Catholic parish in Trick County, and no, actually that's probably Lyon County. You know, the county line isn't marked very well in Land Between the Lakes, but I'm pretty sure that's Lyon County. small parish, and the parish closed. They closed the church down in the early 1950s. So it was not actively on tax property rolls when TVA went through and started having the properties condemned. It was on a family farm. So the family that donated the land for the church, I guess, had never deeded the property to the church. So it never showed up anywhere. When Lake Barkley rose, it cut off the main roads when these bays filled with water, cut off the main road to St. Stephen's. So it sat there for 40, 45 years, sort of unknown, unless you were from between the rivers and you knew that it existed. Some backpackers sort of wandered upon it at some point, and I think there was a lot of conversation getting started about it. So a group of former residents of between the rivers met with TVA to see if they could restore it, because it was this is a picture, a current day picture after a restoration. It was nearly falling down after that much neglect, really since the 1950s. So they asked TVA if they put their own money into it. They wouldn't ask for anything, just permission to do it, to restore it. TVA said no. They asked multiple times and TVA always said no. Once the change was made that Forest Service was running Land Between the Lakes, this group of former residents went back and asked, and the Forest Service said, sure, why not? So around 2005, I think, they started the renovations. They had to backpack in materials 2 miles to get to this place. There was no road to it. Ultimately, the Forest Service cut a road that's about 2 miles long where they could get materials and have easier access to this for the reconstruction. It's a beautiful place, and for so many people from between the rivers, the original residents, this place seems to represent something that survived of the way life used to be there in their home. So it's a very sacred feeling place, not only because it's beautiful and quiet and remote, but also it represents a lot to those people who lost their homes. So this gets to that last chapter that you were talking about that thin place, that one of the themes that I wanted was loss and transformation. I grew up thinking that the lakes and Land Between the Lakes were just my favorite places. As a teenager, I had access to these wonderful places of recreation and wonder and nature. And it was not until those years in Catawba that I realized all this came at a huge price to many people. So I wanted to acknowledge that in my book before this history gets lost and before we don't know these stories. There are 45 lakes in Kentucky. 43 are human created or man-made. So I think it's really important to know that there are so many drowned towns and lost places all across Kentucky, all across the Southeast, wherever TVA and the Corps of Engineers, and of course the Corps of Engineers jurisdiction stretches across the country. They have so many dams and lakes in the West also. So there are many, many lost places. I wanted to mention to you, some of you all may know Bill Cunningham, who previously served on the Kentucky State Supreme Court, was a justice. He lived in the old town of Eddyville until he was a teenager, and his family was moved out. So this is a very personal connection for him. and he has lived in Catawba all of his adult life. So after Drown Town was published, I received a very special note from him after he had read it. And he said, "My grandfather, my father, and I lost our land to the lakes. I'm touched by your whole work, the stories of the various people and families intertwined, but nothing more moving for me than in your acknowledgments." And he said, and he quoted from my acknowledgments page, "Thank you for the sacrifices made on our behalf and in the public interest." And he said, "After 75 long years, you're the first to say that." So I think that's really important, that the people who gave up so much get some acknowledgement of their loss and their displacement, loss of culture and loss of place, too. Those are enormous issues, I think, for Western Kentucky. And for any place that, even major highways take places and move people, and it is in the public interest, but there is a price. So I think I'm going to open it up for any questions. If there's anything else you'd like to talk about in the book or anything, yeah.
Jayne, the book is wonderful. I read it, I
Thank
loved
you.
it. I have a question. You talked about all the different things that were either dismantled or moved because of the created. Do you know what happened to the cemeteries?
Well, that's a good question. Many of the cemeteries in Old Catawba and in Old Eddyville were high enough that the lake water would never reach that high. But there were many, many cemeteries that were moved. There are probably many cemeteries and individual graves that are probably under the water of the lakes. TVA and the Corps of Engineers promised and had a mandate to move all cemeteries that were brought to their attention. So, there are a lot of small family cemeteries in rural areas. If there were still family members to report those cemeteries, then they were moved. Some families die out. If no one reported that cemetery, I'm afraid some of them are probably underwater. I know that there are lots of places, if you Google Drown Town, because that's a universal term, that's not my term. There are lots of drowned towns all around the world. And if you Googled that, there are some very evocative pictures from places in Alabama where when the water goes low there, at Winter Pool, you see these graves that still, they're like open graves. So either
There's one at Lake Cumberland.
is there one at Lake
Yeah.
Cumberland?
When the water's down, you can see
You
it.
can see it. Yeah, there's one on Kentucky Lake that when the water goes low enough, the monument is still there and intact, which seems like, for boat captains, that might be an issue for your propeller if you go in too close in that bay. But many of the cemeteries were moved. Yes.
So what was involved in finding all those old pictures?
These pictures, well, I use lots of different resources. It's, those flood pictures, those old, like 1937, 1939 flood pictures, are all Corps of Engineers photographs. I guess someone comes in when there's a major disaster like that, fortunately, and photographs and documents it for the government. There were also, there's a wonderful archive at Murray State University of every building that was raised in Land Between the Lakes before they were torn down. So you get a sense of all the, little farmhouses, the motels and restaurants and schools and churches. So you can see all of those. So I went through those archives when I was not only putting this together, but when I was writing the book, because it really gave me a sense of the place in a way that I've never seen before. Land Between the Lakes, opened to the public, I think in 1967, 68. I remember it as a child. I remember going there, but I never knew what it looked like before. So the archives are really important for that kind of research.
What's the significance of the name of your house, Ordway? That seems to ring a bell.
That was the family name that built the house. Apparently, in the research that I did, the Ordway family built our house and the house next door for their daughter when she married. So it should be just really close. They had the same stained glass windows in both houses too. I learned that the Ordway family ran the livery stable in Catawba for many years, and that, you know, they were a well-to-do family. There's also an Ordway Hall at Murray State University. They donated money to the university, or had been longtime supporters, so there is a dormitory. I think it might have been torn down by now, though. You know, this rebuilding of dorms, modern dorms are not what we knew in college. One of the things I also wanted to explain is that it's a novel in stories, or a linked story collection. I chose that structure because I wanted to tell lots of different stories around the lake. I wanted to tell Cam's family story, and when they were moved out of Old Eddyville to the new town of Sycamore. I wanted to tell the story of the appraiser who comes to appraise property and starts to see land value in a different way. It was not just a matter of the right numbers and the right comparables. I wanted to show one of the prisoners in Eddyville who witnesses the deconstruction of Eddyville, the town. So I wanted to give all these different voices to tell a more complete story.
When the homes were deconstructed and moved, did the government pay for that, or how was that paid for?
Yes, that was part of
They
it.
footed the whole bill.
That was part of the buyout. If you wanted to keep your home, I think they paid for the moving costs because they were not buying out a house, you know. And of course, there's a lot of resentment too that people who had property between the rivers, which then became between the lakes, that there's a lot of resentment from former residents who would say, you know, we had the opportunity to develop major resorts or marinas and those kinds of things, and you paid us basically the value of our property as subsistence farms, not as lakeside property. So there's still a lot of resentment for that. And that also is one of the reasons I wanted to tell Margaret's story as an outsider, because when I think of Between the Rivers, I don't have any family connections there. I don't know what it was truly like to be moved out. So I wanted to give some distance there. I'm not trying to step into the shoes of the people who actually experienced it. So I wanted to tell a lot of the story as an outsider. So Margaret gave me the vehicle to do that, you know, to say all the stupid things like, this is so pretty, why would you want it to go back, you know? And also a lack of understanding on her part of what these rural communities meant. She had not experienced that. Any other questions?
Well, thank you again.
Thank you, I
for the
really
presentation.
appreciate
The book
this.
is worth reading.
Thank you.